Hi there, this is Grabowski and Jeff Lajoe with the Daily Hampshire Gazette. We are looking at the start of the UMass football season. The Minutemen are opening 2021 at Pittsburgh on Saturday at 4 p.m. in Heinz Field. And I think there's a certain amount of cautious optimism from UMass fans this year. Just, I think if nothing else, because it can't really get much worse than the past year or two.
Yeah, Kyle. I mean, you not being from the area, but you've been around the team enough the last couple of years to kind of see the trajectory of how things have gone. Myself as an alum have really seen this trajectory over the past, decade, anyway, since the team moved up to an FBS program. So I guess I want to ask you first, because I mean, you've been at, training camp throughout here to start the season. You've been at all these practices. You've seen kind of how the team has looked early on. Now that they get ready to play their first game, as far as kind of the biggest differences about this year's team, or, what's kind of stood out to you about how this team looks so far compared to, it's been a tough couple of years for the Minutemen.
I think the sheer size of the team is worth noting, and Walt Bell has brought it up a lot, and it's been something that we've talked about, but I think it's worth mentioning because having the 110 players lets you do things that you can't do when you have like 75 players that they had a couple of years ago in Walt's first year, or maybe 90, just because you can have guys get reps, they can really learn and be in that position. And I do think that them bringing in some of the transfers that they have, having Tyler Lyder, the quarterback, having Kayron Adams at running back, some of your guys from North Carolina in the defensive backfield, I think those raise both your floor and your ceiling, because even if these guys didn't stick at a program like a Colorado or a North Carolina or even a Rutgers, just being recruited to that level of football shows a level of talent and I think athleticism and smarts that is something that is worthwhile to add to your program. And if nothing else, if they just come in and are good college football starters, that's an improvement on what UMass has had in a lot of places. And if they can be great, if they can be at the level that they didn't get to show because of a lack of playing time or opportunity, then that's even better for UMass. If they can have, 3/4 or 3/5 or half of their defensive backfield be Power 5 or Notre Dame players, that's going to be tough to complete passes against.
I wrote something for the Gazette earlier this week about kind of the Las Vegas expectations of this team and kind of where that sits at going into the year. And I know the numbers that they have that are available, 1.5 wins, 2 wins, some places kind of as your over under for the season expectations at length. I mean, the schedule is, I think going through it, looking at the 2 games against FCS teams, you've got Maine and Rhode Island, you've got games against kind of teams that are also in that similar UMass realm, UConn or New Mexico State, as those are probably your 4 games that you're looking at as the most winnable games and possibly the chances for their only wins. But is, in your mind, what is the expectation for this team? Is it to win 3 or 4 games? Is it to be competitive? Is it, what if fans, what can they constitute as a successful season?
I think they need to sweep the FCS teams. Like, you can't lose to Maine or Rhode Island. You just can't. And I think people are realistic. I don't think they're expecting 6 wins in a bowl game, or I had somebody tweet at me 14-0, and I just want to believe that much in anything in my life that this man believes in the UMass football team. But I think UMass football has become somewhat of kind of a joke to some people, not either nationally or just in general, especially if you look at, I think the hockey program has eclipsed it in a lot of ways. So I think if you're a UMass football fan and you're being really, truly honest with yourself, you just want them to be competent. You want them to be competitive. You don't want them to be getting their doors blown off the moment they step off the bus. And I think that's a really honest, realistic goal. And I think that's going to help them win certainly more games than last year. Obviously, I think you have to, and you're given more opportunities. But I think they have the thing that can give people a lot of hope with them is they have a lot of home games. They have 6 games at McGurk, and weird things happen on the road for teams. Like, you can, if you're not ready to go into an environment and you just roll in thinking like, oh, we've got this easy win, let's go, then they may be able to surprise one of them. Because it's not like okay, you're playing Pittsburgh, BC, Florida State. Like those are tough ACC real football teams. But then, and you're going to Coastal Carolina, they're in the top 25. That's going to be tough. But you're bringing in your Eastern Michigans, your Toledo's, your Akrons, who are good established programs on a national sense. But at the same time, you can catch one of those teams if you catch them sleeping or somebody has a big day or somebody has a bad day or if you get a couple of bounces. So I think if you're hoping for a small handful of wins and not looking lost, because I think that was a lot of the issue with last year where people were just like, oh, we should cancel the program. UMass is terrible when the conditions last year were not conducive to playing football at all. Like you only had 10 preseason camp practices and compare that to 30 this year. They weren't able to practice during the week a lot because they were subject to some really strict quarantine procedures and testing procedures, which I think ultimately worked well for their safety, but it wasn't something that benefited them on the field. But they did have a lot of guys that just played. Like they had receivers that played a ton. O.C. Johnson played a ton, Josiah Johnson at tight end, and just a lot of these really young guys that I think Walt Bell admitted a couple times probably shouldn't be out there. But they played in actual college football games that count, and it didn't cost them anything in terms of eligibility. And I think when you meld that experience with the leadership and the talent you've brought in and a coaching staff being established and Walt Bell going back to his play calling abilities, I think you have a chance to acquit yourself well. Like, I don't want to be like, oh, this is going to be a great team. I don't think they're going to be a great team, but I think they're going to be a team that's showing progress. And I think that matters to people. They just want to show progress and not like they're stuck in the same rut.
Yeah, I think it's really going to be the first year that Walt Bell kind of has that ownership of this team. I mean, this is his quote unquote third season here, but last year being what it was, his first year, 1-11 with largely a very barren cupboard. I mean, this is going to be kind of his first real all right. And I know he's talked about that too. He's said a few times, this really kind of feels like my first full year, my first real year with, the guys that he's got into the program. So I think that's going to be interesting. But I did want to talk at the end here about this weekend's opponent, Pittsburgh, because, old friend Mark Whipple is, I think that's the storyline that people in Western Mass are latching onto is, all right, Mark Whipple, coach here, OC at Pitt. What's that dynamic like? And, you had a story in today's Gazette about Mark Whipple and kind of that dynamic. And it doesn't sound like he's really harping on his time at UMass as something that's driving him this weekend.
No, I don't think it is. I think there are people who think like, oh, he's going to run it up on UMass, but I think at this point, again, it's been 2 years that it would just be like commenting mean things on like your ex's Instagram when they're posting vacation photos with their
right.
new partner. Like, I think, it's impossible to write the history of UMass football without Mark Whipple. And I think there are obviously players on the team that played for him, but I don't think they're viewing it as UMass versus Mark Whipple. I think they're very much focusing on Pitt and the players they're having to deal with. But I think Taylor Edwards, one of the senior tight ends who played for Whipple, he was like, I want to show him how much I've grown and how much of a better player I am. So I think there is still a genuine amount of affection for him, even among the players who, are probably happy that they get to see again somebody who gave them a chance to play college football, to get an education like this in some cases. So I think there's probably more friendly feelings than people are outwardly saying in a pregame press conference. And that's just what you have to do, right? You can't be like, oh, I love those guys, they're the best. And it's like, well, then why are you over here? Or like, oh, we love Coach Whipple. We just think he's the greatest and we wish him all the best. That would be a bad look. And I just think it's one of those things where it's like, they're both in the place that they want to be at this point, and they're just gonna play the game. I think nobody needs any more motivation necessarily.
No. And I mean, it's something merit to it, because I think reading a lot about Pitt as well this year. I mean, Mark Whipple's job is not exactly ironclad after this season. I think a lot of people are not huge fans of his play calling and whatnot in Pitt too. So again, when you say, will he run the score up? I think that's what I've seen that mentioned a ton on UMass Twitter. People, I wonder if Mark Whipple's going to run the score up, blah, blah, blah. But I think it's less about that and more about him just calling good plays and doing his job, because he's in a position too where I think he's not worried about UMass feelings and more about, I need to do what's best for this team and myself going forward, because there's no guarantee after this season for him as well.
Right, absolutely. And I just think when you're a professional, like you can't, and this is what Pat Narduzzi, the Pitt coach, said. He was basically like, in this profession, you can't let that get into your, you can't let that enter into your brain. Like you can't let the emotions overtake what's happening here, because there's too many other things to think about. Like you can't be worried about hurt feelings when you've got to deal with Karen Adams and Ellis Merriweather. Like you can't. It's just not something that works well for you if you're trying to win football games. Like I don't think Petty wins a lot of football games.
No. So I'm not going to ask you for a score, but what's your kind of expectations? What are you thinking as someone who's been around the team here for a few weeks going into this first game? I mean, what are you expecting to see from them?
I think they are going to try and run the ball well first. I think they're going to use a lot of play action, whether they're running the ball well or not, because I think that kind of defines where their quarterback, Tyler Lytle, can go with his reads. I think they're going to try and make things straightforward, because the one thing they have brought up is this Pitt defense is going to be really in your face, going to be really aggressive. And I think if you know that, you're going to try and do things like throw screens, run play action, have just things to make them think a little more than if you're just trying to run right at them, because this is still an ACC team. You're not going to be able to just power run right at them and beat them. You're going to have to use some smarts. You're going to have to use some guile. And I think that's something that Walt Bell was brought here to be, as an offensive mind and somebody who can scheme an offense. So I think him calling these plays and having his fingerprints on it, I think they're going to show themselves well in those first couple quarters. I think ultimately a ACC team like Pitt that's had multiple draft picks over the past few years and has shown that it can bring in and develop guys is eventually going to wear down a program like UMass that is building and probably pull away late. And this also could just be me drinking the Kool-Aid. Like I look at Tyler Lytle, I'm like, that's a college quarterback. I look at the running backs and I'm like, those are college running backs. The receivers are really athletic. The defensive ends are getting really good coaching. The offensive line being coached by Alex Miller, a former UMass All-American. I think that's really where you're going to see the most improvement, honestly, is the offensive line, because Alex Miller, like in talking to guys about him and in talking to him, he really will get the best out of this line and make them into a unit and make them both technically proficient and just make them, he uses the word consistency a lot. And I think ultimately that's what you want from anyone, is just consistency, but especially your offensive line.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, folks in Western Mass, I'm excited to see 4 p.m. on the ACC network, this game, UMass and Pitt. I'm excited to see UMass Twitter right around 4 p.m. On Saturday, when people decide / realize that they don't have ACC network, or are like, where is this game? How do I find it? That'll be exciting. That'll definitely be a hotbed of activity come kickoff, whether people have access to watching this game or not. So
my prediction, and this may even be what I do, I think a lot of people are going to just head down to the hangar. And I may do the same thing. So if you want to swing by the hangar, you may be able to watch the game with me, because I don't know if I have access to ACC network either.
It's quite the mystery. We'll find out. Everyone will find out together. Otherwise, the radio call obviously works wonders as well. So we're gonna plan to do this every week, game day, the day before the game. Just a quick preview here on. Previewing, like I said, the 12 games on the Minutemen schedule this year. So, yeah, with any final thoughts?
Make sure you're following both. I'm on Twitter at KyleGRBWSK, and you can follow Jeff at Jeff_Lajoe. If you want all of your UMass coverage, you can go to gazettenet.com or pick up your Daily Hampshire Gazette. Subscribe to the Daily Hampshire Gazette if you're not.